Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a throwback look at the original 12-inch MacBook here in 2023. This was a model that debuted in 2015, making it now 8 years old, so time really does fly. The 12-inch MacBook was a strange product. In some ways it wasn't successful, leading it to be eventually discontinued in 2019 with the introduction of the MacBook Air with Retina display, and the last revision was in 2017. But in other ways it was ahead of its time. For one, it was Apple's first fanless, completely silent MacBook, which we now have with the M1 and M2 MacBooks. Unfortunately though, at the time, it was a much less powerful chip. In fact, it was woefully underpowered, some would say, with the Core M5Y31. It's a dual-core processor that turbos up to 2.4 gigahertz, and for sure, it offers much less horsepower than similarly priced MacBook Pros of the same era. It was one of the first laptops on the market to feature just a single USB Type-C port, which unfortunately has become more of the norm these days, although even on Chromebooks right now, we still tend to have at least 2 Type-C ports. But nonetheless, it all started with this unit, for better or for worse. Although we can argue that it's a misunderstood product, since it's closer to something like an iPad with a keyboard, the first thing that stands out is absolutely the size. Even today, it remains as the smallest MacBook that Apple ever made, and the entire thing here weighing in at around 2 pounds. Many Apple fans, in fact, hope for a newer refresh of this model to be revived, now that there are custom Apple silicon around, with M1 or M2 just in a 12-inch form factor that would benefit those looking after ultra portability. The 12-inch MacBook also introduced the gold color, in fact this more modern Apple aesthetic, which is still retained to newer MacBooks to this day, made its debut here. So very streamlined, the Apple logo no longer glowed like on older units. Now the entire MacBook here is unibody, made out of aluminum. Even the hinge is full metal, which was actually a first of its time. On the right-hand spine, there's access to dual noise cancellation microphones along with the 3.5mm headphone jack. Always nice to still have that port. Finally, the back here just offers soft touch rubber feet. Playing devil's advocate for a moment though, one of the benefits of having a MacBook is the huge popularity, resulting in lots of parts being readily available. So if you pick up a unit, for example, that's used, you can very often find back covers with the battery integrated for as low as just $10 a pop. So interestingly, it actually makes repairability, at least the battery part, quite easy and low cost compared to other laptops which might be harder to come across parts. With that being said, other components, including the SSD along with the RAM, are all soldered onto the logic board, which by the way takes up pretty much just this small section here on the unit. Everything else, this entire surface is battery, and you can open up the unit with just one hand, like on most premium ultra portables. Inside, for a 12-inch computer, we have actually a very spacious keyboard. In fact, Apple claims it still is a full-size layout because they have minimized the bezel size on the left and the right edge to make the keyboard go all the way out, compared to on other units which maybe have a speaker located on the side. With that being said, the keyboard was very controversial because it was the first time the butterfly switches made their debut. These keys feature notoriously shallow travel and feedback, which some folks just weren't a fan of at all, but perhaps it was the poor repairability that was the nail on top of the coffin, where certain crumbs as well as dust particles, if they got lodged inside of the keys, made them unresponsive. You could blow it out with some compressed air and kind of shake the laptop a little bit, but it's just not as robust as regular scissor or membrane style keyboards. I personally fall into the camp of not minding the typing experience. Sure, I would like a little bit more tactility, but I actually kind of like the overall sound as well as the sensation that it makes. So for me, at least, writing out emails isn't so problematic, but it is one of those things which is very hit or miss depending on your personal preferences. What was universally praised though was the trackpad, which for the first time Apple introduced the Force Touch mechanism. So similar to iPhones with haptics and force touch, no matter where you are pressing on the unit, it will respond really well. There is a vibration motor underneath which is simulating a physical press. And that also means less moving parts. The tracker here never physically depresses, but the sensation is surprisingly real. The entire surface is large, crafted out of glass, which is super smooth for gestures and navigation, and the ability for you to click anywhere without worrying about it with even amounts of pressure also kind of made Apple known as one of the premier makers of touchpads and trackpads. Now, the inside here again is crafted from the same aluminum metal, that unibody finish, as from the external, so it just feels very cold and premium, also quite easy to wipe down. Now, on the very top of the keyboard portion is going to be the stereo speaker system, which we will do a demo of later on, but I will say right away that it is one of the most impressive speakers built into a compact 12-inch laptop. And up top, we have that 12-inch Retina display, which is IPS LCD with a 16:10 aspect ratio, so not quite as stretched as on some standard 16:9 displays, but also not as boxy as 4:3 screens like on iPads either, kind of in between, but still is a pretty good balance I find for most things, whether it's for video consumption or doing a bit of light work. Of course, a 12-inch screen in general will still be a bit on the smaller side, but one can argue that that's also the whole point of having a unit with ultra mobility that's super easy to throw in the backpack, even forget that it's there and take it with you when on the go. Again, sometimes even lighter than a iPad with a third-party keyboard attached. It just is that slim and that small when you're touting it around. Now, another point of criticism when this thing was new was, of course, the pricing, which, like most Apple products, if you're looking at specs alone, it's not going to be the best value, retailing at $1,300. With that being said, you can now find this machine at around $100 to $150 when shopping around. It actually is one of the cheapest aluminum unibody MacBooks with a relatively modern design and aesthetic. Still, putting things into perspective, this is a $100 laptop from 2015, but if you were to venture into the Chrome world or look into the Windows world, you can find options such as the Surface Laptop 2 for not too much more, and that's a model from 2018-2019, which is almost 4 years newer than this machine. So in terms of raw horsepower, again, you are still retaining more value because it's Apple at the end of the day. So it's a beautiful panel, and also one of the reasons why it was preferred, at least to some folks, over the MacBook Air from 2015 was back then the MacBook Air was still using a TN display, which had very poor viewing angles, and it was only 720p, whereas this one is coated in a layer of glass, has much superior viewing angles, brightness, contrast. Even to this day, it doesn't look too much out of place. The top also housed the iSight or webcam, which is only 480p or standard resolution. It was also one of the cons of this particular unit. It's all right, but after going through a pandemic, we can all attest to how certain unexpected events can cause those functions to be more important. Again, the keyboard is also backlit like most MacBooks, so it makes it pretty easy to type even in darker environments, something we've come to expect on premium ultra portables, and MacBooks in general have just a ton of variance when it comes to brightness levels that you can adjust. With that being said, when it comes to older tech in general, and especially the 12-inch MacBook, there are a few things that you have to keep in mind when it comes to usage and degradation. The two most common cosmetic flaws would be on the keyboard, over time, oils can degrade the paint of the keys and result in spots which are a little bit more see-through, such as this N key, as you can see there. Its aesthetic doesn't affect the functionality, but it's also something that has proven to be not quite as long-lasting as perhaps folks would have hoped. The second one being the actual display having an anti-glare coating that in some cases can wear down if you are repeatedly wiping it, and can cause a little bit of delamination or certain spots that look a little bit shiny compared to other regions. This unit in particular is not yet developed that syndrome. However, it is something to look out for when purchasing a used 12-inch MacBook. Other specs in here include 8 gigabytes of RAM, which again is soldered on DDR3. It is using Intel integrated graphics, which is the HD 5300. That is just barely getting by with some light usage. We have, of course, Bluetooth as well as Wi-Fi built on in. The 39.7, again, watt-hour battery, around just an hour and a half to juice up. And if you pick up a newer replacement or one with a lower cycle count of, say, under 100, you can usually expect to get upwards of 8 to 10 hours of usage. So it's actually not outstanding in terms of M1 or M2 levels of endurance, but also not bad. At least it takes very little juice to recharge, again using a power bank, as well as you can get through about a day's work without worrying about it too much. Now, if you have higher recharge cycles on a used unit, then you can expect shorter endurance, of course, in some cases falling to, say, only around 4 hours or so, but like I said, pretty easy to repair for just a few bucks, so that's actually one thing that isn't too problematic. In terms of the software experience, it came originally with OS X 10.10, but on this model has been upgraded to the last supported macOS 11, Big Sur. So you won't be able to install Monterey or Ventura on this 2015 model, but the 2016 version of this 12-inch MacBook, which has a slightly faster processor, does support Monterey, and then the final 2017 version of this supports up to Ventura. Now, when navigating around the UI in general, things are still feeling quite snappy and fast, and that's because macOS is a derivative of Linux, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a little bit more lightweight on a clean install compared to Windows. So I would argue that slightly weaker hardware on a Apple product isn't necessarily quite as noticeable. Granted, it's not going to be a speed demon, and for sure, if you use an M1 or M2 MacBook, you'll notice how much faster and snappier it is. Certain animations will have a little bit of stuttering here and there, but all in all, really not bad. Again, the entire thing being fanless and quiet is just ahead of its time, at least in that department, although the unit does get noticeably a little bit warm at the bottom right palm rest region after you're pressing it for more than, say, 25 to 30 minutes. One benefit of the 12-inch MacBook was the 8 GB of RAM being the base model. You couldn't really upgrade it, but at least it didn't come with a 4 GB version. So today, 8 GB I would say really is a minimum when it comes to computers in general, so at least that spec is satisfied, and you are able to do a little bit of multitasking, opening up multiple tabs in the browser and not have to worry about it too much. Again, that Force Touch trackpad is easily one of the selling points of this 12-inch MacBook and newer units. You can even set up additional controls, including how much of that haptic vibration you want to feel when pressing down. So right now we have a medium, but you can turn it down to light or firm, and it will feel like you are clicking on something softer versus harder. Like any product in the Apple ecosystem, of course, you get access to services like FaceTime. So it is, again, a very low-cost way to get into this ecosystem. If you have family members that are using Apple products, you'll be able to communicate with them. However, what's a little bit strange is Safari is often tied to system level updates, which means that if you have the system actually running on an older version of OS X, the Safari browser will be out of date, and there's no version to update that browser until you also update the operating system. But thankfully, you do have third-party browser options available, including Google Chrome, including Firefox, which even on an older version of the system, if you didn't want to upgrade the OS, you could still at least get a pretty modern web browsing experience. Jump into a site like The Verge, and you can tell that on a full desktop version of the site here, lots of videos and a pretty complex page. Scrolling still feels pretty smooth, especially with this glass trackpad, and in general, like I said, the performance is better than you'd expect. Granted, things do start to boggle down as you open up more applications. Part of that is due to the RAM filling up, but if we have, say, 5 or 10 tabs open, the pages start to get a bit slower to load. But as you can tell, when it comes to doing a bit of web browsing, not too problematic at all, and I can also jump into something like the full screen view for a more enlarged experience, since screen real estate is going to be more precious on a smaller panel at the end of the day. Jumping into a YouTube clip, and I will go into full screen. Some feedback there being, as aforementioned, the speaker quality is surprisingly good for something so slim. In fact, it might be the best sounding speakers I've heard on a 12-inch system, coupled with this display, which still looks quite good to this day when it comes to colors as well as the viewing angles being pretty wide and generous. And the overall loading speeds are also, like I said, not bad for simple tasks. You can still playback videos, buffering speed is reasonable, maybe not lightning fast, but also not terrible either, considering we are streaming up to 1440p here at the moment to leverage the maximum pixels that the screen here is capable of showing. So for simple schoolwork as well as office work, if you're just limited to, again, emails, creating some essays as well as PowerPoints, even Excels, it's things that this computer can handle in general. Now, some final notes here. If we are taking a look at the passmark score when it comes to the benchmarking, again, this Core M chip is a little bit shy of 2000. So this is going to be quite similar to entry-level Intel Celerons and Intel Pentiums that are new today. So it's not obsolete yet, I would say, especially on some optimized apps as well as simple tasks like web browsing with macOS. It's serviceable. Of course, when it comes to gaming, that's the area where the 12-inch MacBook, Core M's in general, are just not suitable for. Unless you're looking at really old retro-style emulators, you're better off just streaming on the cloud. So if you purchase something like Luna from Amazon or xCloud from Microsoft, it offers a good enough experience as long as you have a tight internet connection. So that's more or less it as far as a revisited look at the 12-inch MacBook. In terms of is it obsolete? I would say it still has some life left in it when it comes to these, again, lightweight tasks, and you're willing to make do with something with a little bit less horsepower. Granted, I think for the average user, spending just a bit more to get a newer machine will get you a much better experience. But again, if your budget only goes so far, then at least this gives you an idea of what to expect in terms of one of the least expensive modern unibody MacBooks out there. So thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews. That's been a look back at the 12-inch MacBook 2015 edition.